Make Real specialises in creating immersive learning solutions across a range of technologies. To download their latest academic paper on how to turn learners into activists, visit makereal.co.uk/activists. What's it like being an L&D practitioner? Navigating the corporate and leadership dimensions of an organisation, dealing with its gravitational forces, its biases, assumptions and inexplicable blind spots. My guest this time says it's like string theory. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning. Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power.
Knowledge.
Education.
In this world of learning we inhabit, so full of woo, self-congratulation, clickbait-fueled argumentation, BS and snake oil, it's a relief for a change to talk to someone sensible. Someone who is less concerned with stirring up controversy than when giving sound, practical advice based on experience. That's our guest this time, author of the Learning and Development Handbook. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact. Who is she?
Hack Facts.
Michelle Parry-Slater is Learning and Development Director of Kairos Modern Learning, a learning consultancy that blends social, digital and face-to-face learning. She's also an associate consultant with the CIPD, co-founder of the hashtag L&D co-work community and, take a deep breath Katie, charitable trustee, PCC chair and church warden of St Mary's Redbourne Parochial Church Council.
So, Jay Curtis, Head of Themes. Were we singing from the same hymn sheet?
No hymns, John, but dogs were a bit of a theme.
I like dogs.
Sadly, most of their contribution, which was vociferous, if not always to the point, got edited out.
Shame.
For the rest of it, you discussed Michelle's excellent book, the place of L&D in the organisation and the way it's changed, and the new skills these changes might require. And of course, you asked the obligatory AI question.
There's always an AI question.
But why?
It's obligatory. Michelle Parry-Slater, it's a real honour to have you on the podcast, and I mean that sincerely. Welcome to the Learning Hack.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honour to be here.
We're both honoured. Your book, The Learning and Development Handbook, is an admirably clear and practical guide for any learning practitioner to follow. Can you summarise briefly what it's about for people who haven't come across it before?
It is indeed a handbook, so there's lots of sections in it. It's a bit of a how-to guide for learning and development, essentially. And those sections enable it to be picked up and put down. It's the sort of thing that might sort of sit on a learning professional's desk and they need to kind of go and have a conversation with a stakeholder and they might just think, oh, what mindset do I need to be in for that? And pick it up, have a flick through. That's kind of how I wrote it.
Right. What made you feel that there was a need for a book like this? And I should say it's been out a couple of years now, so you've also had a chance to get feedback about it, and it'd be interesting to know if you feel that you're hitting the need from what people say to you.
So I originally wrote it for people like me. So I used to be a learning and development professional, a global head of learning in a corporate environment. And there was only me in learning, had a couple of people that worked alongside me. But where was I going for sort of ideas or thoughts or inspiration? I just felt that there wasn't a book like that out there. There was a lot of books sort of telling me how I should be doing things, but not a lot of books that were kind of giving me the how to do some of those things. So that's who I wrote it for. I selfishly wrote it for myself in a former life. And with regards to feedback, you're right. It's been out for a couple of years. And a lot of people are saying, well, I never thought about learning in that way, because in L&D, we tend to jump to the solutions. And actually, the solutions don't even start in my book until, towards the middle.
Yeah, that's an odd plot structure.
This is Elsie.
Well, Elsie, you're welcome to the podcast, and I'm sure you'll make more sense than some of the other guests do.
Hopefully not more sense than me, John.
L&D isn't rocket science, perhaps, but according to you on page 40 of the book, it does seem to have something to do with string theory. Can you explain what that's about?
I love that you picked up on that. You're the first person in 2 years to ask me about it. And it's a bit of an indulgence, this whole metaphor. It's a little bit tenuous, hanging on a string, so to speak. But actually, really what that was about, apart from the fact that I wrote a lot of this during lockdown and my daughter was teaching herself A-level physics, because that's what happened with A-level students at that time. And so we had a lot of conversations about physics, and the gravitational forces are really what I'm talking about here. The gravitation, the magnetism, the strong forces, weak forces, all industries, all businesses, all departments, all teams have got forces at play. And so L&D isn't as simple as chuck stuff out there and it will land. You really do have to think about what are the sort of strings that need pulling, what are the forces that are at play, what are the politics, I guess we might want to phrase it that way. And what is interesting is that although no one's explicitly asked me about that in the 2 years the book's been out, it is the area that people end up being concerned about. You know, they'll say things like, Michelle, I've done everything that you said in your book. I've gone through my strategy. I've spoken to my stakeholders. I've done good consultation. I've created content and learning experiences, but yet the learning doesn't land. And it's to do with the friction. It's to do with all of these forces that are pushing and pulling around your organization. And so thank you for that question.
I thought it was very interesting. And one of the things I liked I read in the book was the way you would talk about what the UX designer would call the context of use so much, what actually happens within organizations that stops things getting done and those things you have to overcome. And I thought that was really interesting. And the reason I brought that page 40 string theory thing up is that I get the sense that behind this book, this very practical, good sense, common sense guide to getting workplace learning done, behind this, there is something else hiding, which is a bit more about strategy and organizational development. So in a way, it's kind of false bottomed. You're obviously very interested in organizational development, OD. Where do you think the dividing line is between OD and L&D? And should there even be one, perhaps?
Such an interesting area to look at. And thank you for picking up on the fact that I tried to write a real practitioner's guide. But what I found was I was almost, an OD practitioner without knowing it. I'd not heard of the phrase when I was in business, in corporate business. 9 years ago, I set up my consultancy, but prior to that, always doing L&D in-house. And I'd never heard of OD. I didn't know what it was. And so investigating L&D and OD and where the edges are is a massive area of interest now, because is there a difference? Should there be a difference? There's two disciplines and they are separate. One is looking at the more holistic, bigger picture, and one is more focused on what does the individual need or the business need through the individual. So I do think they are separate disciplines. They are obviously both concerned with development. But for me, it's where those things rub together. It's where the edges are. And I've set up a podcast called Learning from the Edges for exactly this reason. How can we work better together across our disciplines? It's a really important area. There is sometimes a gulf. To be honest, John, it's the only way I know to be. In practice, it's the only way I know is to look at the big picture. I just don't know any other way.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I've had conversations with a very large organisation who have united their L&D and OD. They brought OD together with L&D in one department, and that's going to be an interesting conversation. So, folks, this is kind of an ongoing theme that we're going to explore in the Learning Hack. So a lot of what you talk about within that sort of theme is the conversation between learning and the business. And this is something that comes up again and again. It's felt that L&D has an image problem, perhaps even a self-esteem problem. I think we see various strategies that people use to try and reposition L&D within the business, because learning people are always looking at marketing, and marketing likes to reposition things. Being incredibly data-driven is one of those strategies. We're here for your KPIs, or being evidence-informed. We're the high priests of learning theory, as it were, to parody that approach. Or else making themselves over as performance consultants. What makes you think you need a training? They're all interesting strategies. How would you approach that issue? And is it different? Does L&D have to be different in every organisation?
I think yes and no. Sometimes there is this sense that every organisation is unique and we've got a unique set of problems. But fundamentally, organisations are people. And where you've got people, you've got similar types of issues. But there is context, and you really do need to, as an L&D, understand the context. I talk about it in the language of your business. You need to understand the language that your business talks about in order to have a useful conversation in your organisation with the people that are in there. So yes and no, it is different in every organisation because of that context. But at the same time, these are systemic, people-based issues. Learning is learning. To go back to your comment about the image problem, does learning have an image problem? I don't think that anyone outside of the L&D department really cares about learning. And I think that this is where we have some of the problem, that, we're very passionate, we're very engaged as people professionals, but the rest of the organisation wants to do what they want to do. They work in finance, they want to crunch the numbers, they work in operations, they want to be in operations and make stuff or sell stuff or whatever it is the organisation does. So I think we have, it's not an image problem, we have an understanding problem. And it's how we understand our own organisations, how we understand the context, the language, what they're there to exist and try and make. And when we get that right, then actually we don't have an image problem because we're fundamentally part of the system.
I think it's fair to say you want L&D people to think in a more strategic way. What new skills or skill sets do you think this requires?
I do think L&D need to think more strategically. That's a fundamental. I mean, the book starts with strategy for exactly that reason, that if we create something in learning that looks good or sounds good, seems good, how on earth do we know that there's any value to that unless it's rooted in our business strategy? It's as simple as that for me. It's absolutely that simple. So in terms of skills, it is a shift. Is it just a shift in language? Is it that shift from being a trainer to being a learning professional? Or is it more fundamental? And I think it is more fundamental. It's not just about changing the words, it's about changing the approach. And so think like an ODer, but operate tactically like an L&D'er.
Yeah. And my previous question, we sort of pulled up those various positionings, like being a performance consultant, being a learning guru. How important do you think it is to people to know about the learning theory that underpins this area?
Well, this podcast is all about the learning theory, and I learn a lot from listening to it, I have to say. So thank you to you and to Donald for running through all of your amazing theorists. That's been absolutely a major bonus from a learning perspective. But we do need to understand that stuff. We do really need to professionalize ourselves. It's not just about sticking some slides together on a PowerPoint, getting your, fiddle toys or card packs out. It's so much more than that. It's about consulting with the organization. I'm a big fan of Nigel Harrison's work. He and I have spoken about that a lot, because we really need to understand what those gaps are, and we need to fill those gaps. You've mentioned page 40. I'm going to mention page 166 of my book, because on that page, always is getting the book and looking it up for those at home listening. I genuinely think that we must be advocates, and we must be advocates for the right solution, for the right problem, for the right people at the right time, for the right reasons, delivered in the right way. But so many times in learning and development, our skills, we either are a face-to-face trainer, so we forget that we need to also be a digital facilitator, or we are an instructional designer. So does that mean we don't need to be, a consultant? Of course, we need all of these skills. I've got set lists in the back of the book: mindset, skill set, tool set, and data set. And they were important for me because this is the shift from when I said earlier, I wrote the book for myself in corporate L&D, and the shift away from my set of skills, where I started out face-to-face trainer. That was my skill set. But I realized that when I was traveling all around the globe delivering learning, who was doing the back office support for the questions that they had? So if I'm in Moscow, who's helping Madrid? If I'm in Amsterdam, who's looking after the London guys? And so we needed to morph our skills beyond just the train attainment. They really do need to be understanding, as I say, professionalizing learning. And that comes from mindset. It comes from being things like open to listening. It comes from honing your ability to discern what's important, what's not important. It comes from understanding the data and how we use that data to inform our suggested solutions. I'm, as I say, all about the right solution for the right people at the right time. So it's gathering all of those things in order to then inform what's the solution. And then we need to look at our tools. What tools do we have? And so often I see people running after the next shiny thing to plug it in because, it must be cool. Everyone's doing it. But actually, that tool might be totally the wrong tool for the context that you're working within. So I think from a skills perspective, we really do need to big ourselves up on data, big ourselves up on the whole person, the mindset stuff, and then really understand the digital tools that can support us. And of course, better facilitation, so face-to-face tools too.
And there are two skills that really, or skill sets that have really kind of increased over the recent years. And this is true in kind of many disciplines within the organizations. That's got of data, which you mentioned, and technology as well. Being able to master the new technology tools as they come up, and particularly now, I think with media technologies, things like, do you understand how to do learning podcasts and videos and all the other stuff, all the other ways that learning content presents itself in nowadays?
I think there's something in discernment there, because do we need to know all the tools, or do we need to have a good network of people who we can draw on when we need them? I think there's a danger if you become incredibly proficient on Captivate, that all your solutions look like they need to be Captivate solution. And I don't think that that's very helpful. So one of the reasons I started the podcast was to learn new tools myself, to learn the skill of editing a podcast. I'd never, been on a lot of podcasts, but I'd never done a podcast as a host, and learning those skills and then learning how to edit. But I'm putting my hand in the air and admitting defeat, because the time it takes, well done to your editor, Isaac, because I know the time it takes to do this well, that actually the purpose of my podcast is the conversations, research for potentially another book. And so I need to focus my energies there. And so the discernment initially was, I want to learn this skill. And now I'm like, no, I need to buy this resource in. And so to go back to an earlier part of the conversation, OD or L&D, knowing as an L&Dir when you need an OD professional to come in and support your work, or even vice versa, is actually part of the skill set that we now need. In the same way as you've got OD and L&D who need, you need to know when to bring each other in. It might be another profession that you might need to bring in, and knowing when to do that. So you might need a data analyst, for example, to help you understand the data. It's good learning for you as an L&D professional, but it's also good learning for the organization. How do you work with outside suppliers, or how do you get people in? How do you work alongside procurement? All of these things are very different than when I started in my career, standing at the front, being the person with the knowledge and giving out that knowledge. It just isn't like that, and hasn't been like that for a long time.
You're right there. I think that's a mindset area that has become more and more important. Is if I put it this way, so many of the technology tools put things on your desktop and make them appear a lot simpler and easier. Suddenly podcasting, the technical bar is quite low, although it's a terrible time suck. All the stuff is there. The interfaces are quite, you don't need to be a programmer. They're quite user friendly. All these tools keep arriving that allow you to do stuff, on the desktop. And it's seductive because, as I say, it's a terrible time suck. And also you start to run into kind of quality problems very, very quickly. As you say, I think it's more and more important that people develop that skill and mindset of, I need to delegate this, I need to use my time this way and that way. And they're very transferable skills, of course.
You've described the last few months of my life, because I thought, oh, great, these tools are really easy to use. They're sold to me as really easy to use. And to be honest, they are, but it's the time. And so I need to weigh up, time versus skill versus learning and so on and so forth. But what a great lesson for all L&Ders, because everyone who doesn't care about learning, we said earlier, I care about making stuff, or I care about selling stuff, or I care about the finance because they're the departments I work in. And then suddenly you're asking me to learn. And then maybe you need to teach me how to learn through this platform that you're presenting to me. I don't care about any of that. So you have to think about it from their perspective and making it as easy as possible and not a time suck for the individual learners. I don't like that phrase, but I guess you know who I mean, the people who are learning things.
Yes. The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. That leads us on to another question, really, which is, you could see people spending more and more time disappearing down that ChatGPT rabbit hole, or Bard, or whichever is the latest one, or Bing. So it leads us to the obligatory AI question. Most people in the space have some sort of mix of enthusiasm for the possibilities and fears about potential downsides. You're much too balanced a person, I sense, to be either a booster or a catastrophist on AI. But I'm interested in what thoughts you do have when you see the rapid way these technologies are developing at the moment.
Thank you for your kind comment about me being balanced. I really do try to be that way, because I think then you can gather all your data, gather all your evidence, and make an informed, evidence-based decision on whatever it is you're trying to consider. And so when it comes to AI, I haven't tried ChatGPT and the new ones that have just been released as recently as today. I haven't tried them yet because I'm just watching. And I actually think that you would imagine somebody like me who's involved in learning technologies, who's involved in digital learning, that I'd be jumping at them. But what I've found is a little bit like the Betamax and the VHS thing. Just watch, what's spilling, what comes forward, because I find the market finds the way and the market dictates the way. But with learning technologies, the money that is invested, the absolute hundreds of thousands of pounds that's invested in technologies, it then becomes, is it the open market? Is it the users? Or is it those that have got the better backers? And those better backers aren't necessarily backing the right horse. They're backing the horse that they've chosen. And so I try to seek out the technologies that are slow and steady, the technologies that have potentially, not tried to go big and bang. They're not trying to make profits for their backers, for their venture capitalists. They're trying to do the right thing by the industry. And so actually, it sounds really old-fashioned, but there are some LMS providers out there. And yes, I said LMS, Learning Management Systems, which have been around for forever. They're trying to do the right thing. They didn't jump onto the LXP bandwagon when that was potentially a bandwagon. They're not necessarily jumped into the chat interface stuff. They've not, trying to do the bells and whistles. They're trying to help the ordinary person in the ordinary company provide learning in a way which is accessible within their organization for people that don't really care about learning. They just care about doing their job. And they need to demonstrate that they're compliant. They need to look at reporting, and they need to embed knowledge, behaviors, and skills changes. So actually, is it always about the shiny thing? Sometimes it's about doing what we know really, really well. Controversial, potentially. Does it make me look old-fashioned? Potentially. I'll go back to my statement. Learning is a multifaceted dice, isn't it? It's not a two-sided coin. It's the right solution for the right people in the right time, in the right way, and all of that stuff. So
yeah. Well, I don't think you'd be alone in that, because I really did analysts a lot and have a lot of contact with a lot of different learning systems providers. And it is interesting that occasionally you'll find someone like Craig Weiss jumping up and down about a system which says, okay, this is basic, it's an LMS. It's not making any bones about that. But the way it's done and the simplicity with which they actually solve real problems makes this a standout piece of kit. And that would echo, I think, your kind of pragmatic approach there. But looking more generally in terms of L&D and how it has to deal with the changes that come with the AI, you must have a few fears about potential downsides in that.
Actually, I'm never afraid of it, to be honest, because the potential, I'm pretty much an optimist, and the opportunity is there. When we always go to the fears, and this is anything, I fear change, I fear technology, I fear doing my job in a different way than I've always done my job. Actually, you're missing the potential opportunities. So something like ChatGPT, if you can get AI to write content for you, which then frees you up to have better consultative conversations, why wouldn't an L&D want to do that? Because actually the value is I'm providing content to you that you really, really need. Should I spend hours of my life writing that? Or should I spend more time having really good conversations to understand your need?
Of course, another way that it could kick out, my personal view is that I'm not at all afraid of AI, but I'm afraid of what bad actors are going to do with it. And not just bad actors, just kind of misguided governments as well. And one can imagine with the increasing power of generative AI, a huge amount of new tools for the information wars and for cybercrime and so on, which will come back to L&D as we need people to be trained about how to evade these risks, how to minimize the risks, how to overcome, catastrophes that might happen.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories about this type of thing is a massive oil company. When we think about our role within that context that you've just described, that learning people will be the ones that train you not to do the bad stuff, even by accident. So you're absolutely right. It will come back to L&D that they need to be the ones that say, don't open that dodgy email, or do be understanding of what's fake and what's not fake. But one of the best stories I've ever heard about this is an oil company. So the oil company IT department came to L&D and said, everyone's opening phishing emails. You have to train everyone to stop opening phishing emails. And of course, the reality was it wasn't everyone opening phishing emails at all. So L&D wisely said, let's follow the data, send out a fake phishing email, and we'll see who's opening. And we'll go right in there and we'll train those people. We'll talk to those people. So actually, it is going back to everything I've said at the beginning. It's about data. It's about understanding your audience. It's about taking that holistic view and not just jumping in, not just here's a solution, here's an e-learning for everybody. Can you imagine the expense of putting that e-learning out, the physical expense, but also the emotional toll on the organization? Everyone would hate everything from the learning department if you were pushed through a course every time somebody had a problem.
Yeah.
So they followed the data and they targeted the opportunity of learning to those people that really needed it.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense. Lastly, it's usual to ask where people can best follow you. We'll put your contact links in show notes, but it'd be interesting to know what you think about where people should really go and what you're up to that's really exciting, like the podcast.
So the podcast is very exciting for me, especially as it's not out yet, it's coming out, and I'm having really good conversations as I build that. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share it. It's learning from the edges. But you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on LinkedIn. I've got a unique name, Michelle Parry-Slater, so I'm easy to find. I'm also the person that's wandering around my village with 100 dogs who are all barking today, and I appreciate your patience as we've been going through that. I do love my dogs, I have to say, so you'll often find me in the dog park. But from a work perspective, I love chatting. I love being with people, and I love giving people the opportunity. So actually, I'm going to promote L&D Co-work. So L&D Co-work, I started with Fiona McBride.
Okay.
And we started that in 2015. L&D Co-work is an opportunity for people in the learning profession to just work alongside others. We find the space and we provide the space for free. And we charge you nothing to come. What happens in that space is entirely up to you. And the reason we do that is because, let's go back to who did I write this book for? Learning professional. I just want people to have ideas bouncing, opportunity to talk. Does this make sense? Am I going crazy? What are you doing about the AI that's coming on board? And L&D Co-work is picking up again post-pandemic. So we have volunteers who host, and I'm really proud of the fact that we give that space for people to have these conversations, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's about people talking to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you also tell listeners about the people and sources you look to and listen to in developing your own knowledge about learning?
Well, I'm not going to blow smoke, but it's true. This podcast, especially when it comes to the theorists, I would always, because I came out of industry, my career started in teaching English in Japan. When I came back, I moved into global mobility, a niche area of HR, moving people around the world because I'd lived in another country and done that myself. I ended up, because I had that teaching background, the new people sat next to me. I'll sit with Michelle, she'll tell you what to do, she'll teach you what to do. And I formalized that. And that's how I fell into learning and development. And so I didn't understand about adult learning theory, andragogy, what even is that? How do you pronounce it? How is it different than pedagogy? So I've really valued the resource that you've provided. So genuinely, thank you. But I also love books. It's not a surprise that I ended up writing one. I don't love all books. All books are not created equal. Some books are really hard. They're really hard to read, and I don't mean that in a I'm not very good at reading way, but actually when it's so when there's pages and pages and pages of text, I'm not a fan, because I want to be able to dip in and find that bit, that nugget. So most of my books, I mean, this is an audio medium, so I'm holding up my book, which is full of post-its, and most people would be a bit horrified at the state of my books, but the more post-its, the more dog-eared corners of pages, the more I value that author, because I do love books. I also go to industry magazines, and I try to go to adjacent communities. And I'm going to give a shout out to David Hayden and Steve George. They've recently written a book called Adjacent Learning, all about where we can learn from adjacent communities. So I don't always read just about learning stuff. I read a lot like the HRD magazine, so a lot about HR, the people profession more widely, history magazines, things that are about our world but are not necessarily within learning, because I think it gives me a broader base from which to pull ideas. And I'm also, my final area on this question is research reports. I love the research reports that come out of places like the CIPD or Mind Tools, the old Towards Maturity reports. They still hold such a lot of weight. And it's important for me to get a sense of what's the market doing, what's the industry doing, what direction are we going into.
So a lot of good pointers there, a lot of good advice. You're a fund of good advice, I think, for anyone in L&D. And thank you very much for sharing all that with us today.
Thank you. I just try to be in service of others, and that's really my whole reason for being. If I can help other people to enjoy this profession, which I love, then why wouldn't I do that?
Well, you've helped us all a lot today. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it.
Don't worry, we love the doggies.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to our sponsors. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship and your Patreon contributions. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube. And you can contribute at patreon.com/learninghack.
The next episode of Great Minds on Learning comes after Easter, and it's about online delivery. Then watch out for a bonus episode of The Learning Hack, where instead of my guests banging on, I get to bang on for a change, courtesy of Kevin Alster's excellent podcast. Till then,
stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.